Hi everybody, I'm Suzette Martinez Standring, and thank you for tuning in to It's All Right with Suzette. And today we have a very special guest, Karl Giberson, who is a science and religion author, and he's going to talk to us about his book that will be coming out June 9th, called Saving the Original Sinner: How Christians Have Used the Bible's First Man to Oppress, Inspire, and Make Sense of the World. A very provocative title. And so he's here with us today. Karl, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I know that you are a professor of science and religion at Stonehill College.
Yes.
And that you're the author of 10 books, and that the Washington Post has called your previous book, Saving Darwin, it's one of its 2008 best books.
Yes, I was very excited to get that recognition.
Well, it's really great to have you here today, and I would like to ask you about your new book. Now, I know that in the Bible, Adam appears in Genesis 1, and he disappears after Genesis 5, after living 130 years, and you have written an entire book about his impact and significance, and question his reality. Maybe you'd like to tell us a little bit about his book, or his existence, rather.
Yeah. Well, Adam is one of the most extraordinary parts of the Western cultural tradition. I mean, until very recently, everybody believed that this was how the human race originated, that there was a first couple placed in Eden by God, and that was just a standard part of history. People that wrote history at the time of Newton and Galileo, for example, would begin history with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and then they would work through the Roman Empire and into the Renaissance and so on, just taken for granted, the same way we would take for granted the existence of George Washington as an important figure in the birth of the United States. And then as Adam's historical existence became questioned, a lot of things which were attached to Adam went into jeopardy, and people began to wonder, well, how will we understand human origins? How will we understand the special features of humans, the image of God that humans have always believed they possessed? How will we understand the origin of sin and evil in the world if it didn't come from Adam and Eve's sin? And all of these questions are all attached to Adam, and so any discussion about his existence opens up a Pandora's box of other questions, many very troubling.
Well, you know, it's interesting because if you take it, as you say, can we prove the existence of the very first Adam? But there's no disputing that we had to start from somewhere. And if the idea is one of a starting point and disobedience, right? How does it really, how does it affect the rest of the Bible story, in that if the message is about, you know, redemption and that we are all flawed, in what way does that change that basic message about the flaws of humanity?
Well, the problem is the enduring problem that is known as theodicy. It's the problem of evil, and how do we understand this world that we live in, where people die of cancer, children get killed, Amtrak train got derailed this last week, people are killed there. I mean, just terrible things happen all the time.
Yes.
And many of these things are huge. I mean, you have floods and tidal waves and volcanoes that bury entire villages and so on. You have species that go completely extinct. I mean, 99% of all the species that have ever lived have gone extinct, right? So our world, our existence is just filled with death and suffering. And where does this come from? And Christians have never wanted to say, oh, well, God just created the world that way, because that would be inexplicable. Like, why would God create a world where the extinction of species was the normal thing that happened? That doesn't seem consistent with any kind of model for God's character. And so we need an explanation for why the world is a terrible place. So the idea that God created a perfect world and put humans in it and gave them free will, and they made bad choices, and this brought all of the evil into the world, provides an explanation for why the world is terrible. So that's one of the important roles that Adam plays is sort of getting God off the hook, so to speak. Evil is our fault, not God's fault. But the second important role that Adam plays is the role that St. Paul creates for him in the New Testament. I mean, Adam, as you mentioned, kind of disappears from the Old Testament, but then he's kind of pulled from obscurity by St. Paul, who interprets Christ as being a second Adam. And so you see long passages in Paul that are kind of theologically very rich and quite central to the Christian understanding, in which the plan of salvation is one in which we have a first Adam who messes everything up and a second Adam who fixes it. And so they kind of go together, a pair of bookends on the story of the fall and redemption. So if you lose the first bookend, the historical Adam, how do you understand the second bookend, the work of Christ? And so this is why so many people feel like Christianity has to retain some kind of a historical Adam who fell and sinned in order to keep the idea that Christ was a second Adam as a central doctrine.
So are you saying that if you get rid of Adam, then it pulls into question the whole mission and purpose or existence of Christ as a savior?
Well, it creates a problem for one model of how that works, and the standard model that has been at the heart of most Christian understandings across Catholicism, Protestantism, and all the splinters of those is the model of creation, fall, redemption. I mean, it's this clear structure, and like that's supposed to be the Christian story: perfect creation, fall into sin, and restoration in Christ. And so that particular model doesn't work if we don't have a figure like Adam in the beginning who caused that fall. So one of the things that sort of we lose when Adam disappears is we lose the fall. So we lose the possibility of coming up with some simple explanation for why there's so much evil in the world. Evil seems to be just a part of the natural order, and thus to have been seemingly created by God. And so this creates a problem for that particular understanding. Now, as I argue at the end of the book, the fact that human beings are troubled creatures and that we have deeply flawed natures and we are in need of redemption and salvation, this is, as G.K. Chesterton put it, the only empirically verifiable Christian doctrine. I mean, anyone can kind of look at the human condition and say there's something wrong there. I mean, we can look at ISIS and so on. We can look at greed on Wall Street. We can look at growing inequality and the fact that we don't care about that. I mean, you can look at so many things and say, like, yeah, there's really something terribly wrong with the human race. What is this? And it's very easy to understand how our evolutionary history created creatures like us that have all of these problems. I mean, we originated in tribes, and so our tribal instincts to not like people who don't look like us and to look out for ourselves and not other people. I mean, these are instincts programmed into us by a million years of evolution. So the fact that we are this way doesn't become mysterious at all. It just becomes rooted in a different past, rooted in our evolutionary history, rather than the fall into sin of our first parents. So in that sense, in a more sort of liberal understanding of Christianity, we can say we need to be redeemed, we need to seek salvation, we need to find some way to lift ourselves above these circumstances, and we can talk about the message of Christian salvation in those terms.
Now, I guess I want to ask you, who is your audience in this book? Because when I read the book, it seems that you are putting forth an explanation to Bible literalists, people who believe literally that Adam was the that don't believe in evolution or that kind of a thing, and yet you use a lot of writers of Catholic background to kind of explain some of your positions. I mean, when you talk about explaining things to Bible literalists, why would they listen necessarily to people like Augustine and Aquinas and a lot of the famous writers in the Catholic faith?
Well, they won't. And they won't be persuaded by my book, I don't think, either. I mean, I used to be more optimistic that one could make a case and convince biblical literalists to change their views. But the sort of entrenchment of that view that the Bible has to be preserved as a literal, infallible document is so strong that there's almost no assaulting that fortress. What I'm doing in Saving the Original Sinner is really trying to explain kind of to the rest of the world why the literalists are so uncomfortable with the idea. So I'm speaking often sort of about the literalists, but I'm sort of writing for the person who might be a kind of what we call a mainline liberal kind of Christian who doesn't understand why losing the historical Adam is such a big deal. And they would not be aware of sort of the central role that Adam has played in Western culture, in the history of the Christian tradition, and in the understanding of a lot of Christians today. And so I'm really trying to make it clear that Adam is a very, very important figure. And Adam really is the reason why evolution is so controversial. I mean, lots of people who will accept that evolution is true will kind of stop when you get to Adam. Right?
Well, yeah, for myself, I think of Adam as mainly a starting point, and the story of deliverance, the spark of deliverance, where they're cast out because of disobedience. That's what I see as the central story of Adam, the initial disobedience and a disobedience to the higher calling of God, or spirituality, as you call it, through the years, which is why we have war and everything else.
Yes, I mean, certainly all the things that have sort of flowed from that first disobedience are extraordinary. But now we have come to the position where we just don't think there can have been kind of a first disobedience anymore. And so we need to root those human behaviors in another part of our nature.
We're going to take a break, and then we're going to return to talking about your book, Saving the Original Sinner by Karl Giberson. So come back to us in just a few seconds. Hi, thanks for tuning back into It's All Right with Suzette, where we're talking to Karl Giberson, author of Saving the Original Sinner. So, Karl, for those people who read the Bible, and this may be a very new concept to them, what your book poses, questioning the existence of Adam, what would you say on how it affects the actual teachings of the Bible, the talk about God's mercy, love, a higher standard of living, the message of salvation through Jesus Christ? How does that affect, in what ways does it affect that?
Well, it rules out certain theological models for how this would work, and it sort of pushes us in other directions. I don't think these other directions are so unorthodox that Christianity can't go there, and in fact a lot of more liberal denominations and many Catholics have kind of made peace with that already. But it does force some major overhauls of the kind of central model of how sin entered the world and the origins of evil and so on. I mean, it raises difficult questions about how we should read St. Paul, for example, because it seems very clear that St. Paul believed that Adam was a historical figure, and he just kind of spoke naturally about that as if this was an untroubling part of history. Now we look and we say, well, the human race is much older. It originated in Africa, not in the Middle East, and so on. There never was a first couple. There never was, the human race was never just two people. And so, I mean, these are pretty well established conclusions now from evolution. So we've got to sort of make peace with that somehow. And I think the central issue is going to be how we understand our human natures.
You know, in your book, you talk about Pereire.
Yes,
the writer Pereire, who addresses the issue of whether or not there was one Adam that we could all point to, or whether the one Adam was the first of the Jewish tribe, of the Jewish race. And because God chose the Jewish people to bring his son through, those were his chosen people, and the people that eventually Jesus was born from. So, and I told you earlier how I had participated in a DNA research study through National Geographic and IBM that studied human migration, and they talked about how there's a mitochondrial Eve that we all trace back to one woman. And you say that there's the equivalent of a mitochondrial Adam. It's just that we're not sure of the time and place. And it's interesting because they say that these people, we all trace back to them, our lines. They may not have been the first or the only ones, but they were the ones whose DNA line endured through the centuries.
Yes, and the best research from the geneticists is that the human race was never smaller than 1,000, 1,200, something like that. That there's a certain diversity in the human gene pool now. I mean, I have genes, you have genes, but they're not. I mean, some of them are the same, but many of them are different. And so, if you look at the totality of genes in the human gene pool, and you say, okay, how could this many genes have originated, and how long would it take? Mm-hmm. There's just no way you can get that genetic diversity in 6,000 years from two people. Mm-hmm. Mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam are much more ancient than the Adam and Eve of the biblical story. And it's somewhat confusing, probably misleading, that they have those names, mitochondrial Eve, because that sort of invokes the biblical first woman.
Well, it invokes the idea that we all come from one person, and that we can all share a gene. But it still doesn't take away from the idea. Even if you take away the historical part about can we pinpoint and everything, there's still the ancient story of disobedience and redemption, in which we have to kind of perhaps reach out to something much higher than our basic selves to strive for something more spiritual or higher or better.
And that is in many ways the role that the story is believed to have played in the life of the ancient Israelites. That one interpretation of the story of Adam and Eve is that the ancient Israelites viewed Adam as a sort of metaphor for their own culture, that they had a wonderful land that they lived in, but they fell away from following God's laws, and they ended up being enslaved in Babylon, and they spent a long time in Babylon, and that
7 years in captivity.
Yeah, so this is kind of what happened to Adam. Like, Adam was in a nice place, and if he would have just followed God's very simple rules, he could have stayed there, but he didn't. So he ended up being kicked out, and so the story of Adam is a kind of it's a moral tale to help the Jews realize, okay, we need to follow God's laws, because when we don't, look what happens.
And that's a story that's ongoing to this day, where we're still in some kind of moral captivity to this day.
Yes. I mean,
we could be in a good place, but through our own bad choices and just the seeming randomness of life, we keep getting stuck in or getting kicked out, and we're in exile, inside and out, inner and outer lives. Now, tell me a little bit about your process of writing. You're an author of 10 books, and what is that like for you? What is the research process like for you?
Well, all of my books have kind of grown out of things that I wanted to explore. So I usually get curious about something, and I start thinking, I'd like to learn more about that. And so I do a little bit of reading, and then somewhere along the way, I have enough content for a book, and I start to write. And then in the process of writing that book, I dig deeper. And as I'm digging deeper, I find out some surprising things that I maybe didn't appreciate adequately, and then that will sometimes give rise to the next book. There. And so I'm always sort of writing at the edge of my knowledge, which, I mean, it's sort of dangerous to do that, because a book like this being written by somebody whose training is in experimental physics, I mean, I have a PhD in atomic physics, that's my sort of formal education. And this is but this is a book, ranging over theology and history and biblical studies and biology and so on. So I have to be very careful to sort of sift through sources, and I always give my manuscripts to somebody who knows way more than I do about the topic and say, like, what do you think? Am I on target here? Help me out if I've made some mistakes.
A lot of great research in this that you've done, and it's very understandable writing. I think that everybody brings their personal experience, as you say, to the subject and to the writing. And in your personal story, in the book, you talk about being a disillusioned evangelical or former evangelical. So what part did that play in creating this book and the books that you've written?
Well, by the time I started writing Saving the Original Sinner, I was at the point where I really felt like I was no longer legitimately within evangelicalism. That I mean, evangelicalism is characterized largely by having an extremely what's called high view of Scripture. I mean, some people don't like that, language of high versus low, but I mean, it's a view of Scripture in which the Bible is very authoritative. The Bible is kind of inerrant in some way. The biblical literalists will put it inerrant right down to the jots and tittles and little tiny statements about the natural world. But most evangelicals will not sort of allow that the Bible has sort of serious problems with the way it talks about history, the way it talks about God, or the way it talks about the natural world. And I had just gotten to the point where I felt like, I felt like St. Paul, for example, was just wrong about Adam, right? I mean, St. Paul believed that Adam was a real historical figure, so he drew on that common knowledge of his day, and he made a case based on his belief that Adam was a real figure. And virtually no evangelicals are willing to kind of say that, like, St. Paul was wrong about something. So by the time I was kind of working on this book, I'd gotten to the point where I just thought, like, my view of Scripture and sort of traditional theological dogmas is kind of no longer in that place where you can say this is kind of authentic evangelicalism. So, and this was why my tenure at Eastern Nazarene College in Quincy got increasingly rockier, because the more I was speaking and writing in this way at an evangelical college, the more people got upset with what I was doing there. So this is a book which I felt like I can write, in a sense, however I want. Like, I'm not an evangelical trying to speak to evangelicals anymore, as I was in some of my previous books. I'm simply writing what I think is true. I'm not making a case that anybody needs to go here or go there. I'm just writing what I think is true about this situation.
And what is your process for writing? What do you find to be your biggest obstacles to this kind of writing on a personal level?
The biggest obstacle, I think, is knowing how to evaluate sources. I mean, it's really like in the field of, like in my field of physics, like, it's very easy for me to know that this is authoritative and that's not authoritative and so on. But when you're writing kind of outside your field, as you have to do when you do broad interdisciplinary topics like I do, you read something and then you have no way of knowing whether this is the central view that all the scholars in this field share, or whether this is a minority view. There's a historian, for example, who's written a book claiming that Darwin was largely responsible for the Holocaust. Now, he's a reputable historian, tenured at a research university, but this is an eccentric and extreme position that very, very few of his colleagues accept. But if you just read his book, you would think, oh, okay, I'll use this idea to make a particular case against Darwin, as many of the anti-evolutionists do, not realizing that this is an eccentric and extreme viewpoint. So you have to just avoid getting sort of sucked into minority positions on the fringes of these other fields that you're exploring. And that's why being in conversation with other scholars constantly is so important.
Mm-hmm. And like I said, you draw a lot. We have 5 minutes left, and so very quickly, you draw a lot from people like Aquinas and Augustine and people like that. Again, why the Catholic kind of philosophers and all of that? They're very heavily shown in your book.
Yes. Well, that's an interesting question, and I mean, you could argue. I mean, I think this would be too strong, but like you could argue that like Augustine and Aquinas really should just be labeled as Christian thinkers, not Catholic thinkers, because it's really not until you get after Luther that Catholic comes to mean not Protestant. There. So I mean, Christianity in the West is all Catholic.
Well, actually,
during that
nothing
period.
against the Catholic, but they do have a very unique viewpoint. You know, the whole, I used to be a Catholic, so, you know, the whole idea of saints and things like that, and praying to certain saints, I mean, that doesn't really exist in the evangelical or the greater Christian kind of theology.
Yeah.
So
Fact,
they're very different,
yes.
very, very different.
And a lot of evangelicals
The seven sacraments,
yes.
that's very unique to
Yes.
Catholics, and so. And so I was just wondering, in a way, why they're given a lot of airplay in your book.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for example, Augustine, as I argue in one of the chapters in the book, is kind of responsible for the way we understand original sin today, that there was a lot of diversity in how people understood human nature.
Right. You
And
even say that he pretty much came up with the concept.
Yes, and so I mean, Augustine is the one who kind of says, okay, here's a whole lot of different ways that people have been interpreting St. Paul. These are all wrong, and this is how we need to read it now. Now, Augustine's interpretation of St. Paul, now Augustine didn't invent it. I mean, it's a reasonable interpretation of Paul. So I mean, it's not that Augustine sort of pulls it out of nowhere, but he does sort of shut down a lot of other options and narrows the conversation. And so happens today that conservative evangelicals are all Augustinian in how they read St. Paul now. I mean, they won't admit this because they've just read Paul in this way for such a long time that they think this is exactly what Paul meant and the only possible interpretation. But in fact, it's Augustinian. But the main reason why Catholicism is such an important conversation partner in this is that Catholicism is much broader in how it understands authority. It's an organic, ongoing conversation which takes new science and new ideas more seriously than Protestantism does. Conservative evangelicalism in particular roots everything in the Bible, and so it's really hard to get sort of authority that's not rooted in the Bible. And so evangelicals have a terrible time trying to figure out what they should think about climate change, what they should think about gay marriage and things which just really aren't in the Bible exactly. But the Catholic Church, which views the Bible as one of several sources of authority, is able to kind of have a broader conversation. And when the Pope publishes an encyclical, and there's one coming this summer on the climate change, I mean, these are authoritative documents that are taken very seriously. There's just no counterpart within Protestantism there, which is why I think conservative Protestantism will be stuck in this conversation with this controversy for the foreseeable future.
Yes. Well, it's kind of interesting because I do think that the literalists, there are issues with that, but I think that there are probably millions of Bible-based Christians who don't really concern themselves with things like that, but more of how they develop a direct relationship with God. But tell us how we can get a hold of your book, and do you speak at, are you going to be speaking anywhere soon?
Well, I'm heading out to a conference in Los Angeles in a few weeks. No doubt there'll be some appearances in the Boston area. Usually I get some invitations after a book has come out. it'll be available on Amazon, of course, which is where I buy most of my books, and the local bookstores will have it as well. And there'll probably be a book signing or two in the Boston area, but Amazon's a reliable source.
Karl Giberson, thank you, Karl Giberson. Thank you so much for sharing Saving the Original Sinner with us today. Look for his book coming out June 9th on Amazon.com, and he is a science and religion professor at Stonehill College. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much.